This is Canon Fodder, episode 27. We are live from the depths of space, or maybe we're from the future. We're not sure. I'm here this week with my good friend Marty Phillips. Marty, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good.
So, I know you primarily as, well, besides one of the better writers of dissident lit Twitter, let's say, I know you as a fan of Joseph Conrad. So when you came to me and said, or rather, I came to you and asked what book you wanted to cover, you said, "Oh, we got to do the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch." And I thought that was very interesting because you are a stylist and Phillip K. is not.
Yes, correct. He's very stripped down, to use a term.
So I guess I'm wondering what about this book is appealing to you. I mean, it's a good read, and I definitely recommend people go out and take a look. But what about it in Marty Phillips's mind? Do you find fascinating or interesting about it?
Well, what I like about Philip K. Dick, there's a couple things. As far as writers, he's kind of one of my literally me writers.
Mm,
As far as his like personal struggles and his, I mean, he's just a very maybe to get a little bit of biography stuff out of the way, just to kind of contextualize some of this. Um, Philip K. Dick was born, I believe, in the 1920s. He moved his family, or his mom and dad separated at a young age, and so he moved with his mom to the San Francisco area. And he's very introverted, very hypochondriac child who, and it wasn't always hypochondria. He had a number of actual issues, but he spent a lot of his time reading and invested in these pulp fiction worlds with this kind of overbearing mother figure. And that's not where I'm saying I see parallels in my own life, but just it was very similar to my childhood in that he just spent it in books, and not always good books. Like
mm,
I read a lot of just really crappy fantasy and some better fantasy and sci-fi, and on the better end of those things, a lot of kind of the old H.G. Wells sci-fis and a lot of that
hmm
stuff that for its time would be considered pulp, but in comparison to the quality of work that's come after, it's definitely superior in a lot of ways. But I see a lot of parallels in there as far as the focus of a child and as far as his interests. And then as far as his kind of social reticence and uh, he never really lacked confidence about his ability to write, but he was just very he lacked confidence as far as his ability to break into the mainstream, and he was always very self-conscious about that. And I think that's something that a lot of writers struggle with.
Most definitely. I know a little bit of PKD lore. Is he tried to be a literary fiction writer? He tried to write more rounded stories, and that wasn't accepted. The publishers just didn't know what to do with it, so he had to fall back onto science fiction, which is where he was making money, and that's eventually where this novella comes from.
Yeah, he his writing is always very it draws a lot from his personal life, and so a lot of his characters are kind of segments of people that he were either in his family or that he knew, kind of split up and reimagined into characters that are combined from parts of them. And and so that definitely showed up a lot in his attempts at mainstream fiction were very somewhat autobiographical. And I don't know if the life of an agoraphobic hypochondriac really lends itself to particularly compelling mainstream literature. I know that a couple of his books, I know one was his more autobiographical ones, was published posthumously, and one of his earlier ones was published in France, I believe, while he was still alive. I think it was in the 70s. Um, so he was able to accomplish a little bit of what he wanted, but by and large, yes, his mainstream attempts were stymied at virtually every attempt.
And I mean, one could say that Valis is also sort of a autobiographical work.
Yeah,
just because of that whole, which is fascinating to me. For those who don't know, he had a hallucination or a vision, I guess, from some alien being telling him that his son was ill,
mhm.
and he took him to enough doctors uh, until they ended up finding what was wrong with the boy. Because most of the doctors thought that Dick was crazy and that there was nothing wrong with the boy.
Yeah, and later on in his life, his last couple works, the Valis trilogy, it is much more semi-autobiographical, where he brings himself in as a supporting character or a framing character.
Mm.
And those earlier stuff does have elements of his own life, and there's a lot of that in Palmer Eldritch. If you know the story of his life, it's definitely more explicit later on.
And before we started recording, I brought up Vonnegut because I see links between this and his book Sirens of Titan. We won't really get into that since you haven't read a lot of Vonnegut, but that's very similar to Vonnegut as well. He wrote himself into a lot of his stories. Literally, he had the character of Kilgore Trout, who is this sort of shitty science fiction writer. Anyway, to set the scene, and please feel free to correct me or expand upon anything that I say, Marty, because this is, while it's my show, it's your stage. To set the stage, we're living in 2016 in this book. If, and I say this tongue in cheek, if Al Gore won in 2000. And by that I mean global warming is out of control. The UN is taken over, and people are being deported all across the stars.
Yeah, it's funny. Philip K. Dick has this way of throwing 20 different things that are going on in his world that he's invented at you in the first chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And you just kind of have to sift through it at his pace, which is breakneck at times. And you're like, okay, the world is frying. Okay, there's people who can sort of see the future. Okay, like there's these crazy drugs that people are using. And it's just like so much all at once. And he really builds his world, almost the entire thing, within the first chapter. And that's something that very much came from his pulp years, which he was still writing like short, like Ace Doubleday, double pulps in the background while he was writing his novels, because it was kind of his more constant stream of income, though his income was at times very far below the poverty line. He actually has a funny anecdote. I'm probably going to jump into a couple of these, but there's a funny anecdote he has in his exegesis, I believe, or it could be in his journals, about how when he was married to his second wife, Cleo, he would go to the dog food, this like boutique dog food store in Berkeley, and buy like bulk dog grade horse meat so they could eat it. Oh. And he was really self-conscious about how like the guy working the counter at some point gave him this look like, okay, man, I know you're eating this. I know you're buying this to eat it. And he was like ashamed about it, but also like couldn't really do anything about it at the same time.
Oh, that's really funny.
But anyway, so the writing pulps was always kind of his background form of cash injection. And so his style takes a lot from that pulp style, where you have a very limited, you have a very limited amount of space. You have to just kind of, world building, brain dump your reader pretty fast in order to kind of give them the whole context of the world they're operating in. And Palmer Eldritch is definitely one of those.
And it's interesting too, because especially I've been in a few writers' workshops, as I imagine that you've at least, the types, right? And that's like the first thing that they tell you has to go. Don't exposition dump. Yeah. Don't world build dump. I think the modern conception or the modern advice is world building is bullshit. Which I agree with, and I think can be teased out. But for a Philip K. Dick book, you kind of need that to ground yourself. He's very much an exception to the rule, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, it certainly helps him that his concepts for how these worlds operate and the different groups operating within those worlds are very unique compared to, because I mean, a lot of this fiction he was writing in like the early 60s. I mean, this is a little bit after the era of the Twilight Zone, you know, and
Mhm.
the Twilight Zone doesn't even come close to, you know, the absurdity of a lot of the worlds that he creates.
Yeah,
So
I remember like the Twilight Zone episodes. It's like, man, what if this alien had 3 eyes and a third arm, and they meet
yeah,
each other in a diner? And it's
yeah,
like, it's like,
exactly.
oh, our fleet is coming to invade Earth. Oh no, it's not. It's been destroyed, and my fleet is coming. Like it's
Yeah,
uh, that is. I do love the Twilight Zone, but yet I mean, Philip K. Dick just throws those kinds of concepts. If they're a kiddie pool, then he is an Olympic-sized swimming pool
yeah,
of
and
weird ideas.
the Twilight Zone tier uh, situations are just the set dressing. You know, he throws in little things where little details where it's like, oh, by the way, these moons are all populated, and there's like this thing that happened in the background. You're like, wow, that's like a whole Twilight Zone episode and just like a little aside right there,
Right.
because what he's dealing with is far more, you know, vast and spiritual in a way.
And that's one of the things that's really cool about him as well. And it spans across his entire corpus of work. You know, whether it's do androids dream of electric sheep? Whether it's we'll remember it for you wholesale. By the way, it's funny that whenever these things get adapted, they're always the title's always improved.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what
It's
what
funny
was
because even his own titles were changed from even worse versions
right
by
right?
his editor.
What was Minority Report's original title?
Oh man, I
It
don't
might
remember.
I think it might just be Minority Report.
Yeah, I don't
Uh,
recall off the top of my head.
but he'll have like 5 really interesting ideas thrown at you and then just go with one of them.
Yeah,
Like even in this book, we have precogs, which he
yeah,
doesn't really expand upon. You get a little bit here and there, but he definitely is like, all right, just wait, we're gonna come back to this in another story.
yeah.
Uh,
It's funny about the precogs. It is funny that there's this Dickian way that he will present this wild thing, like people who can, and it's never really fully explained. They can to some degree see the future. It kind of depends on the individual, how capable they are. But there's just this very Philip K. Dick way of, okay, there's these people who can sort of see the future. It mostly relies on just vague visualizations of like newspaper headlines and this sort of thing, but it is helpful and they can kind of give you an idea of how probable something is to happen. So what do they have these people doing? Figuring out how to like produce the right stuff for marketing or whatever. It's just like you have this immense power, and it's just this company is using this crazy ability to like future market stuff, basically.
mm. And then so we also, to get back to the plot a little bit, and then I'll let you throw things around. Uh, we have Barney. He's our protagonist in the story, and he's kind of like a middle management type at a what is essentially a human dollhouse manufacturer for uh, people who are exiled to the outermost parts of Earth because Earth is overpopulated. Basically, the UN is drafting people to go do manifest destiny out in the stars, which is really interesting given Philip K. Dick's background and his agoraphobia. That he thinks like this is a punishment
Mm-hmm.
to go live to go be a homesteader on another world.
Yeah.
So interesting bit of insight into his thinking there. So Barney, uh, he works for Perky Pat Layouts. Which did you read the Perky Pat story?
No, I haven't.
So there's a short story that he wrote that's similar to this called oh, what's it called? It's called Perky Pat or
It's like the
something.
World of Perky Pat or something. He
Right.
wrote it right before this as one of his pulps.
And that's another thing about Philip K. Dick is that he will reuse concepts and words and titles even though they don't necessarily have anything to do with one another.
Mm-hmm.
But he will just reuse stuff, which is actually something that I've tried to kind of do myself in my own writing, because I like when I have a good idea, I just want to kind of stick with it and juice it for everything it's worth.
Yeah, I mean you have to sometimes.
Right. So Barney works for Perky Pat layouts, right? And this is essentially, actually, it's almost like they're a metaverse company if you want to think about it like that. Because of course, one of the things about Philip K. Dick is that he's just incredibly prescient in terms of the things that he predicts that end up becoming science fact. Let's say in the future,
Mm-hmm.
more so than many of his contemporaries or those before him. Uh, so Perky Pat layouts will sell you an apartment almost and various products that you can then use on Mars with the use of a drug called Candy, which is an illegal hallucinogen, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anything I missed thus far, Marty?
No, no.
So what was Philip K. Dick's obsession with drugs? Why the especially hallucinogens?
Well, it's interesting because he didn't actually use hallucinogens themselves very
Right.
often. He said he only used LSD a couple times and he actually disliked it. And he only used it because, he lived in Berkeley amongst a bunch of weirdos and so it was offered to him. I mean, the man was a weirdo
He
himself,
didn't want to be rude.
but yeah, it was offered to him a couple times and he took it, but he didn't become a consistent user of hallucinogenics because he didn't particularly like them. I mean, he didn't enjoy the experience. Although he used things from his experiences with it in his work, he didn't go seeking it out like a lot of people did. He mostly used amphetamines to keep himself functioning, basically, which I think also plays into his kind of very sparse prose. I mean, the man was downing like 3 daily total doses of amphetamines 3 times a day and typing out novels in, I think it was like 6 weeks. He would usually type a novel out within 6 weeks.
With smoke coming out of the typewriter.
Pretty much. And so, yeah, amphetamines were more of his thing, and it was more of a self-medication. He wasn't exactly going out seeking some kind of hallucinatory experience because, I mean, he got those anyway with or without drugs.
Yes. In the background of all this, there is the titular Palmer Eldritch. He is, which is, for my money, one of the best named characters ever, especially for a guy like Philip K. Dick, whose characters are typically kind of humdrum,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the name department. I think Palmer Eldritch is perfect for the character. It's evocative. I really like that character name. So Palmer Eldritch, he's an explorer. He travels the stars, and he's back from a 10-year mission. And the rumor is that he has brought back a hallucinogenic drug from aliens that will put Candy and its uh, pusher, who is actually Barney's boss, uh, Leo, and yeah, that's basically how the plot begins.
And it's interesting. It's another one of these things Philip K. Dick does where there's these ways that his worlds interact that are just so absurd, but the credibility is just kind of lost in how much is happening with all these different things going on in his universe. Because like Leo Bolero, who's the CEO of Perky Pat's Layouts, is also the secret CEO of the Candy, manufacturing and distributing drug empire.
Mm-hmm.
And what people the worst kept secret in the world is that the only reason why Perky Pat's dollhouse layouts matter is because these miserable people on these, moons of different planets and on Mars and stuff hate their lives so much, and living at the frontiers so cold and desolate and pathetic, that they take this drug in order that they can be, transmitted into this dollhouse layout and live inside it as though they're one of the characters.
They
And
yearn for the longhouse.
yeah, and so the idea that Perky Pat's layouts exists as a credible business all by itself is so absurd, because it's even presented in the book that, like, why would anyone want one of these adult dollhouses unless they're using the drug? So it's like there's literally no market for the product outside of the illegal use. And so it's just one of those things that he develops in his stories that when you take a step back from it, it's just so funny and absurd at the same time.
So, and another aspect of candy usage is that if a few people are in a room together and they all take candy at the same time, they can actually interact with one another in the Perky Pat dollhouse.
Mm-hmm.
So this ends up creating a cult of Perky Pat in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
One of the things that is very Philip K. Dick is what I would call a misunderstanding of God, and sort of a shrinking of who God is. But he definitely understood cults.
Yeah, well, he figured out the, living vicariously through the Instagram model thing, what, 5 decades before it was a thing?
Yes. So he actually had dreams of Barbie. Like he was obsessed with the idea of a Barbie doll, and he was worried. I think he said that he was worried one night when he had a dream about Barbie that his wife would find out that they were having an affair. Is very strange guy, but
Yeah, his third, I think it was his third wife, had a couple, two maybe daughters of her own. And so a lot of this obsession started when they bought like a Barbie dollhouse set for his wife's daughters, and he became like transfixed with them. He would like measure them to like see if their dimensions were like anatomically accurate to like human dimensions and stuff. And this was around the time that he wrote the short Pulp first and then Palmer Eldritch afterwards.
which I haven't read the Perky Pat short story. I've heard it's good though. It's one of those. It's on my ever growing to read list.
Yeah, it never seems to get shorter.
So Palmer Eldritch is probably an alien. Well, I mean, Leo says that he is just an alien in Palmer Eldritch's body, right? But then again, Leo's also just not very reliable. We're led to believe, let's say, that Palmer Eldritch has been replaced by an alien being sort of wearing his skin suit, right? I think that's fair. And he has brought back another drug called Chu Z. So if candy is Viagra, then Chuzy is Blue Chew. I don't know. I have all these stupid jokes lined up that I just get out. And Leo is his the thing that makes me laugh about this book is that it's basically just industrial espionage, but on a cosmic scale.
Yeah.
And you have Palmer Eldritch, who may or may not be like a space god, right? More likely to be some sort of space alien deity. And you have Leo, who is just trying to keep his criminal drug empire, his drug dollhouse empires going, and wants to kill the alien because he's muscling in on his turf and uses this sort of sad middle manager divorcee to do it.
Uh-huh.
Very, very strange plot, very straightforward plot, very strange plot, but of course, nothing's ever straightforward in a Phillip K. Dick book, and that's why we read him.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's once again into the absurdity aspect. It's just so funny that, I mean, as it's chillingly put relatively early on, I mean, the question is like, is it Palmer Eldritch who came back? You know, people are asking that pretty early on, or wondering it. And yet, in the face of this, you know, potentially something that could be invading their universe from the prox system, the concerns of a lot of the characters are still just about, I mean, for Leo Bolero, can I maintain my drug dollhouse empire? Or for Barney Mayerson, it's like, you know, can I somehow use this to advantage myself into a slightly higher upper middle management role? It's like they're confronted with what could be like solar system destroying powers, but they're still trying to like, you know, make that agree with their kind of striver mentalities around their, in the face of it, ridiculous business that they're involved
It's like
with.
Space Dilbert.
Yeah, it really is.
And what's interesting, because Barney Mayerson is also just, he's pining for his ex-wife, who the divorce he's like still not over, while also he got this secretary that he's been sleeping with, and she's my favorite character in the book, even though, well, it's either her or like Palmer, but she's very much outside of the absurdity, and she kind of points out these ridiculous things once or twice. But anyway, so we have, this is where the plot gets weird, I'd say, right about the time that Mayerson is told that he's going to be drafted to go live on Mars. He and Leo Bolero have this conversation. Leo wants him to take Choosy and then also poison himself. That way the UN won't approve Choosy, which is, it's interesting that that's the, like, the UN has the power to ban one drug, but will allow another.
Yeah.
And that's never, like, that's never questioned by anybody, and it's also never sort of expanded upon by Dick. It's just kind of,
well, it's expanded on a little in these like very humorous moments, because like early on when Leo Bolero is talking to the UN, he's talking to this Indian representative, and it's funny because he's talking about how like, oh, dealing with the UN and all of their like superstitious like Afro-Asian cultural influences on the UN, which I found very amusing, because that's a lot of like, you know, right-wingers complaints right-winger complaints about the UN. And then he goes on later on to imply that the reason why Choosy was approved as like a legal drug where Candy wasn't is because this UN representative is Indian, and the idea that, you know, Choosy can present this sort of virtual rebirth appeals to his like either Hindu or Buddhist tendencies. I can't remember which. So literally it's because this guy's like priors is being this kind of, you know, third world leader of the UN that is kind of arbitrarily makes Choosy selected over Candy.
you forgot to post the Giga Chad.
Yeah.
So Barney Mayerson, maybe you should take over plot details from here, Marty, because I'm still like, this book is very confusing, especially if you have double-digit IQ like I do.
It is very confusing. So basically, to backpedal a little bit with the whole Al Gore thing, just to provide a little more context. So basically the Earth is burning and they have to get people off of the Earth. And so you're basically selected by draft and then sent to these colonies. And so at the beginning of the story, you mentioned this earlier, but Barney Mayerson finds out that he's, you know, been selected for draft. And so a little detail we glossed over that's hilarious is there's this psychiatrist device called Dr. Smile, which is this central computer that has these suitcases that are wirelessly connected to it. And you can kind of carry this suitcase around with you, open it up, and it's like your portable psychiatrist. But there's this kind of assumption that psychiatry is so worthless or backwards that the main character, Barney, is using this psychiatrist in an attempt to drive himself crazy so he won't qualify for being drafted, which is hilarious because Phillip K. Dick went to psychiatrists consistently his entire life, yet he had this kind of seething resentment like against them the entire time.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you weren't made better and you kept going to these people, you'd probably hate them too.
Yeah. So anyway, after Palmer Eldritch comes back from the proc system, crash lands, Leo Bolero goes to try and look for him. They set up a little kind of sting operation where he's going to pretend to be a reporter, get in, interview him, and then try to assassinate him or find out what's going on. So that fails. Leo is intravenously injected with Choosy, this is where it gets weird the first time, has this crazy long hallucination where he's on this kind of Windows XP home screen desktop, like empty sky, grassy knoll area, and stuck there with Palmer Eldritch. And he has a vision of the future, which is this monument that says that he, Leo Bolero, will overcome and defeat Palmer Eldritch. And he sees these future versions of humans that view him as a hero. And he doesn't know if this is true or just hallucination or what. And when he speaks to Palmer Eldritch agrees, doesn't really agree, but basically says that he's going to let him go temporarily, basically because he wants to see what he's going to do. And so during this whole time, Barney and crew back at PP Layouts don't know where Leo is. They're trying to decide whether or not to send a search party or not, but Barney is afraid, so he doesn't. So when Leo finally makes it back, he blames Barney for not coming to look for him. So then Barney is so guilt-ridden, he basically accepts his draft summons to go to Mars as basically his atonement for betraying his boss in his hour of need. So when he's shipping off to Mars, Leo Bolero comes up with this plan, as you were saying, that while he's at Mars, once Choosy shows up and the colonists if they start choosing it over candy, then he'll take this neurotoxin to make it look like it was a horrible side effect. And then as these absurd Phillip K. Dick plot points go, they're going to have their ultimate victory by suing him in the courts for an inferior product. And that's how they're going to win.
Which is interesting because Leo Bolero is the head of the illegal drug cartel,
yeah.
and it's kind of a secret, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah,
one would assume that if Choosy was made illegal, people would still take it because they're still taking candy.
Yeah.
So it's
one of the, yes, that's the thing about his stories. They're absurd in this way where it's like not a plot hole. It's like this like plot black hole vortex that you just roll with it because you just have to.
You just avoid that part.
And because it's so funny in an absurd way too, that you just, I mean, when I'm reading his stories and I come across these things where I stop and think about it, and I just chuckle to myself and keep reading because it's just so ridiculous in a very like funny way.
Now, was he aware of these things, or was he oblivious to the plot holes? Do you know?
I don't know, actually. I think that a lot of that comes with his pulp background. I think it's one of those things that you just have to roll with, you know? I don't think the pulps were particularly interested in avoiding plot holes.
Right.
And so as far as making sure every I is dotted and every T is crossed, isn't really the measure of what is a good story in that world, is how much you can kind of, blow people's minds.
Yeah, and as if that's the mark of a pulp writer or a writer in general, then Phillip K. Dick is definitely on someone's Mount Rushmore, as we will continue to find out here.
Yeah. So the plan is, yes, to have a horrifying neurological reaction and then take it up in the courts, get Choosy banned. Barney meets this neo-Christian missionary girl on the way to Mars, and he starts, having thoughts about becoming a neo-Christian, but he doesn't appear that interested in it. He appears more interested in her. And then he finally gets to Mars, and Choosy arrives, and the colonists there are deciding whether they want to stick with Candy or switch over to Choosy, and ultimately they decide to switch over to Choosy. and Barney takes it and has an insane trip, where he starts seeing Palmer Eldritch everywhere. Basically, everyone. He uses this attempt to try and go back and get his wife Emily back. But as he's doing this and failing, the people around him, in the kind of characters in this simulacrum he's creating for himself, keep kind of breaking apart and becoming various stages of Palmer Eldritch, who's recognized by his artificial robot arm, his kind of goggle visor eyes, because his eyes were destroyed in an acid attack, and his giant metal teeth. And so occasionally Barney will be attempting to get his wife back, and suddenly someone in the room will have a metal arm and giant goggle visor eyes. And so it's just this reminder that he's in this domain. And that's the thing about Choosy, is people, it's marketed as superior because, unlike Perky Pat's layouts and Candy, you're not limited to, these little commercial models that you have to buy to create this kind of diorama that you can then exist within the constraints of that. Choosy is this, expanded thing where your imagination is the limit and you can go anywhere and do anything. But there's, this catch that you're not living in your own world. You're actually living in a world that is dominated by a Palmer Eldritch, as Barney finds out very soon.
Yes, it's definitely, that's probably the most interesting aspect of the book, because you are trading the deal is, let's say, for these settlers, you are trading the uncaring, sort of indifferent universe that you have at least some modicum of control over in your own life, and you're trading that for almost paradise, but completely controlled by a being that may or may not be benevolent or malevolent.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, you have all these people who are either believe Eldritch to be a god, or that he at least sees himself that way, but in a very limited way as well, because Palmer Eldritch, the alien, can't really affect anybody's lives, like their physical, real lives. He can only sort of affect these trips.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he can affect things indirectly in that what you see when you're under the influence of Choosy can affect your actions, as far as how you, like, whether or not you believe him, whether or not you believe what he shows you or believe what he tells you within that vision. If you believe him that it's hopeless or what have you, or that he actually does control everything, then it's going to dictate whether or not you give up. And you see that dynamic playing with both Leo after he takes Choosy, and then Barney after he takes Choosy, whether or not they accept, is this reality? Is this inevitable? Or do I have the ability to act outside of this? And is this just an illusion? And this plays into a lot of Philip K. Dick's ideas about, reality and illusion. And there's a lot of, there's influence taken from the Vedas. He read a lot of kind of that esoteric old religion and philosophy, and the concept of Maya, which is this idea that there's a veil, this sort of a veil on the world, which is like a magical projection of reality, which can be broken or controlled by people who are, these demigods that possess this magical power to kind of manipulate that. And so the Palmer Eldritch as this character is very much drawn from that kind of idea that, like, what is reality? What is the veil of reality? Can you overcome these beings that have the ability to manipulate that? Will you accept their version of reality as inevitable?
And it's interesting too, because the obvious, well, I guess obvious to anybody who is not an agoraphobic kind of guy, is to reject Choosy, right, altogether. and continue to try and build a life on this desolate planet. Try and make the best of your situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that suicide is not really on the table for people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you would I would think that Barney uh, would at least entertain the idea if his, because the thing about Barney later on towards the end of the novel is he is Palmer Eldritch is able to not only manipulate the reality or the hallucinations that people see, he can also replace their soul, right? So Palmer Eldritch, uh, his plan is he's in a spaceship, right? Leo is also in a spaceship and fires a couple of missiles at Palmer Eldritch's spaceship. So while Barney is sort of in this trip to the future, uh, he's Palmer Eldritch is able to replace Barney's soul with his own. So whoever dies, if somebody is to die in the explosion, the spaceship explosion, it would be Barney instead of Palmer Eldritch. Palmer Eldritch would replace Barney on Mars and live the wholesome Chungus sort of frontier life and date the QT neo Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, the way that it's presented by Eldritch himself, and kind of the reality that you have to accept if he's telling the truth, is that Palmer Eldritch is no longer Palmer Eldritch.
Right.
He's been inhabited by this sort of cosmic bioorganism, and he operates as a bridge from where it originated to where it is trying to get to, which is the Terra system and to Earth. And so him as the prime user of this Choosy, which is this, space moss that exists somewhere out in the stars, kind of gives him the power to move people around within that bridge continuum. And so since he is the prime user of that, he has the ability to kind of shift things around within that. And so he, yeah, the idea later on is that he's going to take the Barney portion of that collective thing and put it in his body at the moment that he's seen ahead and knows when he's going to be killed by Leo Bolero. And so then he will pretend that he's Barney and then continue on. Because later on in the book, near the end, it's made pretty clear that Palmer Eldritch has been, effectively dead since he left, basically, because the only thing that exists within what they see as Palmer Eldritch is his participation in this, this process of this invasion, and this thing that's acting through him. His corporeal form is really just a vessel for it. And so this is interplay of like, I mean, is he dead? Is some essence of him still there? Is his process of becoming part of this and in control of this essentially made him more than human, but also, less than human at the same time, like incapable of being one, person in one place.
So, and one of the things about Philip K. Dick is that whatever he wrote, he inspired 10 stories, 20 stories, 20 plot lines, 20 shows, movies, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And not even just direct adaptations of his work, because when I think of this, I think of, have you ever seen Futurama?
Years ago.
All right. Well, there are two, the brain slugs, right? And they kind of attach to your head, and you become sort of like part of this hive mind brain slug, and the whole purpose is to get everybody else to come to the brain slug planet to get a brain slug.
Yeah.
And then there's also one of the movies. It's The Beast with a Billion Backs, where this sort of godlike creature tries to become one with the entire universe that they inhabit. So, and those are immediate thoughts. You could also say that what's that one movie with Jim Carrey and what's her face, where he tries to forget her.
Oh, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Yeah. You could say that the plot line of Barney trying to undo the divorce with his wife Emily is very akin to, like, you could see that idea coming from that
Hmm.
in some ways. So yeah, tough read in my opinion, but it just, so many ideas come from Philip K. Dick, and it's interesting how adaptations of his work also, just because I think, did they make a Three Stigmata film, or
I don't believe so.
I think they might have made an
Was there
animated,
maybe like an adaptation, like a short film adaptation or an animated?
maybe. I think that, yeah.
The thing is, there were adaptations of some of his stuff in other countries where he was more popular that are kind of, like lost media at this point.
Mm,
That were made in like the 70s. I think there was like a play or something too that, probably doesn't exist in any digital form. But it is interesting because there's a lot of implications in this book, and that's the funny thing, is like it's so absurd and wacky. But like you were saying early on about the name of Palmer Eldritch, it's this sort of, antichrist journey where, Palmer Eldritch, you have the Eldritch Palm, like Palm Sunday, like Christ arriving in Jerusalem, which is at the beginning. You have, you know Palmer Eldritch showing back up in the Terran system, and his ship crashing down on Pluto. You have this like entrance of this being back into the human world. And in the same way with the Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, there's this idea. I don't know if I would necessarily agree that Philip K. Dick had maybe a simplified view of religion. I think that he just tries to recast it in ways that he finds interesting.
mm,
So with this Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, I mean, he even touches this later on when he kind of presents the sort of Abrahamic faiths as a precursor version of a sort of divine invasion. And divine invasions, are a very big part of, especially later on, his view of the world and how things work. And so he's kind of doing a new version of the arrival of a sort of faith, but expressed in a way, that faith is sort of like a parasitic, um, like cosmic biological being that
mm.
replicates itself through people because it needs people, and it needs, to take hold of people's minds and ideas. And um, I think it's sort of one of his little mind experiments that he does with himself when he writes these stories, where he's like, okay, what if I present faith and, proselytization and the movement of ideas and faith as a sort of parasitic invasion?
So what you're saying is the woke mind virus has made the left go insane.
Literally, yes. They were
And
choosy and they chose choosy.
instead of, a good old American candy.
And the interesting thing about this is, context wise, around this time, Philip K. Dick was being, he was entering the Episcopal Church, so he was going to like classes and taking like learning about the sacraments and all that stuff, because he was interested. I mean, he wasn't interested in institutional traditional religion, consistently in his life, but he did have these kind of fits and starts where he would, go back to the church or enter into a church and be somewhat devout for a little while. And
Right.
this was one of those periods. So the guy's on a ton of amphetamines, and I don't want to play the drug part up too much because I feel like that kind of diminishes his talents. But he was very much going through one of his many crises at this point. And he wrote in his journals about how he was having this vision of this sort of demiurgic being in the sky, which is where I think his idea for Palmer Eldritch comes from. And as he learned about Christianity while he was becoming an Episcopalian, he became very fascinated with Gnostic theology and Gnostic Christianity.
Mm,
And so he fixated on this idea of, okay, so if we have this demiurgic evil god that can create its own worlds, like what would the spread of that look like? How does that come into being? How does that, what is that genesis process? And so Palmer Eldritch is, his version of that demiurgic, Gnostic, immoral god. And the story is kind of his own telling of that process put into like this crazy sci-fi world.
Well, and it's funny too, because as you say that, I see Warhammer 40K, and the inclusion of chaos into the universe, right? And for lack of a better term, Philip K. Dick's tendrils are all over the landscape of science fiction, even though he wasn't very popular in his lifetime. Or I mean, he was popular, but he wasn't mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about this post-war age of science fiction that is obsessed with the concept of God? Because we have around this time, I mentioned, Sirens of Titan, which deals with this question. We have Frank Herbert and Dune. We have, even Arthur C. Clarke has an aspect of this in 2001: A Space Odyssey. What's going on in this point in time? Is it the is it nuclear weapons? Is it the end of World War II? What's going on here?
I don't know. I mean, if you want to put it in kind of, snarky terms, you could say like, well, Nietzsche, God is dead, and so now we're just doing the autopsy. But I don't know, because I don't know that Philip K. Dick was particularly terrified of, nuclear vaporization. He was more afraid of, the postman turning him into the IRS, which he very much was. He was behind on his taxes most of his life and thought at various points was hiding out in the back room of his house, sometimes with a gun, sometimes not, convinced that they were going to drag him into prison for his back taxes.
But what could he have possibly owed? He fed his family dog food.
Well, he owed back taxes on his house. Yeah, I don't know with the situation of the income tax at that point, back in the late 60s, early 70s. But it is interesting that his paranoia kind of, was earned to some extent. Like, he was in, Berkeley at the height of the, the anti-war Vietnam movement and all this stuff. It's funny. He actually signed on. This is a pretty funny anecdote from kind of before he was super established, but his name was out there. He signed on to this petition to not pay taxes because, to not support the Vietnam War. And he saw that as like a very moral crusade, but he always kind of regretted it and was terrified after the fact that it was going to come back and bite him, because he was, going to be arrested for having not paid taxes all these years and, making it into this moral stand that he was taking. That's the classic thing with him, is he makes these gestures and these kind of proclamations in his personal life, and then very soon afterwards kind of realizes like, okay, maybe I've gone too far, and gets like very worried and kind of nervous about it. So the thing with taxes was not a completely imagined fear. He had his name on that petition, signed declaration that he would not pay taxes. So they had his signature, they had the evidence.
Well, and if he didn't turn in suspected communists to the CIA, they probably would have gotten him on taxes, like they tried to get Hemingway.
Yeah. Could have been.
Yeah. Now, the more Philip K. Dick lore that I consume, the less I understand about the man, but the more I understand about his work.
Yeah, he's a very, very interesting character. He was married 5 times. He could never figure out, maintaining a marriage for any amount of time. But he really, like, he as much as an agoraphobic who spends most of their time indoors, he made use of his time. He really did. He was
Mhm.
so prolific in, not just his pulps and his, sci-fi novels and his attempts at breaking into the mainstream, but also his, his incessant journaling. He had an exegesis that was like over 1,000 pages by the time he died. Like, the man was always working. During the times when he would, pump a novel out in 6 weeks, he would write for 16 plus hours a day.
Mm.
So, and he was self-conscious about, that he dropped out of college because he was having vertigo attacks. And so he stopped going to college after a short period of time because he would go into the classroom and then, basically get nauseous and feel like the room was spinning and he was going to fall in his face. And so he stopped going, and he was always a little self-conscious about that he didn't have, he didn't have the academic credentials to, have some claim to fame of being part of the academic literary world.
Mhm.
And but he was a prolific autodidact as well, though. I mean, he taught himself German, Koine Greek. He taught himself all about, philosophy and history, just kind of on his own time. So, I mean, his desire to learn was always there. He just didn't have the, the institutional credentials to back it up.
So the end of the novel is Barney decides that in order to save his own life, he can never take Choosy again, because he's able to come out of the Choosy trip where he's about to be killed by Leo Bolero in Palmer Eldritch's body, right? And
Mm-hmm.
he figures to himself that if he can not take Choosy, he won't get flash forwarded into Palmer Eldritch's body, and he'll live.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, Leo Bolero at the end of the book is still seeing people with the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
Mm-hmm.
They're seeing people with the arm, with the teeth, with the eyes, and it's left very ambiguous as to whether or not Leo Bolero will actually have his soul swapped with Palmer Eldritch at the moment of death. So instead of Palmer Eldritch dying, and instead of Barney Mayerson dying in the space explosion, you'd have Leo Bolero kill himself inadvertently.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of there. One of the things that I do like, because as many dark black hole plot holes there are, like you said before, there is a lot left to the reader's interpretation. One thing that I sort of noticed when I was reading is like, are these precogs who can see the future? Are they trying to influence the world so that Palmer Eldritch dies and doesn't come back? Are they the reason that he crashes on Pluto for one reason, or for one instance? Are they, because people in the future tell the quote unquote ghost. That's another aspect of the book. Anybody who goes to the future is seen as like a ghost,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is so the ghost of Barney Mayerson is told that Leo Bolero is a hero for destroying the enemy of the solar system, who is Palmer Eldritch. And there's a lot going on. It's very much not laid out for the reader, and I'm not certain what is intentionally left out and what is sort of, as you kind of pointed out, that pulpy, whatever, as long as it's a good story type thing.
Yeah, because it's left pretty open-ended at the end. I mean, there's the part where Leo is flying back to Earth from Mars with his kind of enforcer, private police guy, and he has this slip up where he forgets that he's Leo Bolero, where his his private police guy refers to him as Leo, and he says, well, why do you keep calling me Leo? And then he kind of breaks out of it and it's like, oh, never mind, don't worry about me, I've got it under control, or whatever. And there's at the end there's this sequence where he's this evolved form of human. There's something we didn't cover, but it's not super major to the plot, or is it? Is that there's this process that like evolves you into like in a more advanced form of human just immediately. Like they hit you with these evolution rays and you become, you know, a more advanced form of human. And so at the end, he's very assured of like, of course I'm, you know, humanity's savior. I'm the most evolved human that I know of. So of course I would be able to be the one to resist this and achieve victory. But you're kind of left with the question of like, well, does him being more evolved actually make him more susceptible? Like, you almost wonder that at the end, because unlike Barney, who seems to have his head on pretty straight about like, I think I can get out of this, Leo at the end doesn't seem to be fully out of it yet.
Right. There's very much this, you know, to borrow the sort of plot, you know, the three classic plots, right? So it's like man versus nature, stuff like that. This is very much in that man versus God tier of story at the end.
Yeah.
Where we had, but what Phillip K. Dick does that's really interesting is he flips it on its head a little bit, because you have this man who thinks that he is more than Palmer Eldritch because of the evolutionary transformation that he's gone through, and you have this advanced alien being in Palmer Eldritch who kind of yearns for a more simple life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's also the Eucharistic element to it, of course, that's explicitly brought up in the story at numerous times. And, you know, there's the idea of the Eucharist, like when you're partaking with the Eucharist, are you sort of joining with the divine for this moment or whatever? And when you have this Gnostic being with its own stigmata and its own Eucharist, like what does it look like to, you know, join with the divine in that moment when it's a corrupt version, you know, of a deity? Because you have, you know, the telepathic jackal. I'm just going to throw this out there and people are going to have to roll with it. The telepathic jackal, not explained, just I'm going to say it. Talking to Barney Mayerson near the end, saying that like you're unclean, like you've been corrupted, and the implication is that after he took Chu Z and participated in this corrupted divine ritual, it permanently changed something about him. And so the idea of Eucharist is pretty central to it too. Like if you partake in a Eucharistic ceremony with, you know, a corrupt version of the divine, then is that something that you can really reverse? Or in your participating with the world and being that is Palmer Eldritch, does it fundamentally change something permanent about you?
Yeah, one could call it its own mark of the beast.
Yeah.
All right, Marty. Well, we're coming up on time here. I wanted to get any thoughts that I didn't, or that we haven't gone over on the book, and otherwise, I think we'll tell people where they can find you and head on out.
I don't think I really have that much more to say about it. I mean, it's one of those books that it's a flawed masterpiece in my mind. Like there's a lot better books you can read, but for just a lot of the concepts brought up and kind of Phillip K. Dick's willingness to just go, you know, dial it up to 10 as far as questioning life, the universe, and everything in it. I think it's definitely worth reading just because the process of reading it, especially once you get toward the end and it's clear the kind of gravity of the issues that he's wrestling with in his process of writing it. And, you know, ideas about the divine participation with that, participation with an imperfect or even cruel Gnostic being, is all very, it's a good read, especially once you get later on into it, and a lot of those kind of bigger questions become explicit. So what it lacks maybe in like plot consistency or, you know, plot black holes, it makes up for in like the concepts that it deals with.
I've when I've read Philip K. Dick, I've often wondered, what if this guy understood people, and clearly he didn't. Mostly maybe because of his limited interaction with them. Five marriages tells you something that he couldn't. He just didn't
It
get
tells
something.
it tells me that women have got problems. Women can't make up their minds.
That's fair. Uh, but
um,
but and when I think about that, I also think, well, if he were different, if he understood people a little bit better, would he have had the time to come up with these crazy ideas? Would there actually be diminishment if he was more socially adept? And I think that's more probable.
yeah, because I mean, you can see how he chooses to spend his time in his books, and I think Palmer Eldritch is maybe more of an extreme example of this. He really doesn't spend a whole lot of time on it. There's some introspection. There's not a whole lot of detail, and there's just kind of the barest skeleton of kind of interpersonal dynamics enough to like make people's relationships somewhat credible.
Mhm.
And then the rest of it is spent on, the real meat isn't making the plot make sense, isn't making these interpersonal relationships feel human. It's about kind of exploring what's outside of that.
Mm.
um but anyway, as you were saying, where people can find me and stuff. I mean, I'm going to be leaving Twitter soon, so I won't be there for a while. I'm probably going to take a hiatus for a couple months to do some writing and some reading. Um, you can find my kind of updated writings that I'm just kind of posting in rough draft form just to get feedback from people on my Substack. If you just search Marty Phillips on Substack, it'll come up. And then, yeah, my two books, Let Them Look West and Millennium, you can get from Antelope Hill Publishing. But that's pretty much, I'm not super active aside from my writing projects anymore. So I may come around, the old zitter every once in a while, but, you get older, you get busy, you kind of have to, pick your battles, what you spend time on.
Well, I'll definitely post your Substack and links to your books. I will definitely co-sign. I haven't read Millennium yet. I've read Let Them Look West. I think it's the best book that anybody has put out in our sphere. It's definitely I tier the writers on Dissident Lit Twitter as who is better than me, and you are definitely on that list. With few others, I will say. I am a big fan of your work. Anybody who listens to this ought to be a fan of yours as well.
That is very high praise. Thank you. And hopefully, hopefully I don't disappoint going forward. We'll see. We'll see. The next project is massive. So
Well, if anything, we will commit digital jihad against those who dare say anything, like the guys at Tookie's Mag who didn't like Holly Hunt or Holy Hunt.
yeah. Well, you can't always get along with your critics.
That's true. That's true. Otherwise, they wouldn't be critics. As for here at the Double Dealer, if you're listening to this, you're probably on our Substack. If not, you're probably listening to this on Spotify. We are finally back on Spotify, which is great. If you want to support us, feel free to buy an issue of the Double Dealer magazine. Issue 13 is out right now. If you really like the Double Dealer, you can become a paid supporter. We're finally getting a few of those on Substack, which is great. People paying us a few bucks a month to help pay writers and artists for our future endeavors. We don't take any of the money that people give us. It all goes back to writers and artists like Marty, like our friends Paul Fahrenheit and Ham, and Caleb Caudell and Brad Kelly, and everybody in this scene that who's writing that you know and love. We're gonna figure out tiers of giving and what that gets you. I think if you become a paid subscriber, I'm definitely gonna have you on Canon Fodder. Yeah, I don't really know how to end podcasts, so we'll just say insert ending here.